I've been in the tech industry for like about 15, 16 years now, and while there's a lot of superlatives that one would clearly use about technology companies and digital companies, our record, I think, in communications is a little bit more mixed, and there's plenty of embarrassing campaigns that have been out there over the time that I'm sure we're all aware of. So our next speaker has spent the last couple of days helping people with a 2-day version of his much more famous 4-day seminar, learning about the craft of telling and writing stories. And we've asked him to give the final address of the day, and I'm really very proud to welcome Robert to our stage. So Robert, if you would join us, that would be great. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Those two previous talks were wonderful. I do appreciate birdsong, and I read once an article by a ornithologist about birdsong, and he explained it a very different way. He said that when a bird is nesting, the male bird goes into song virtually 24 hours a day, in order to let all the other birds in the area know that he is healthy, that he is young, and he will defend his nest. And if his bird song falters, they will then move into his territory and peck him to fucking death. And so I'm going to look at the other side of the coin. I lecture about story. And we've talked for the last couple of days about the art of story, the craft of story, the elements of story, and their relationship. But it was, for the most part, looking at story as fiction, of course. And many of you are, of course, scientists, and you are business people, and are both. And so I thought I would just take a few minutes today and look at story in relationship to life, and in relationship to what we call facts, and look at story as we use it in our own lives, and to hopefully live better. And the starting point of understanding the place of story in life and the relationship between story and fact is to first of all realize that there's no such thing as an innocent story. There's no such thing really as story is just entertainment. No matter children's stories, Hollywood action films, etc. None of this is innocent, because every story contains an idea that is wrapped inside of an emotion. And it takes ideas and it embeds ideas into people irrationally. And the story itself may be sound and logical, but it is delivered, the meaning of it is delivered inside of an emotional experience and a feeling experience. And that is why Plato wanted all the storytellers thrown out of Athens. He said, these poets are dangerous people. They deal in ideas, but they do not deal in ideas in a rational, logical, philosophical way. Instead, they wrap their ideas in the beautiful emotions of poetry, but these are ideas nonetheless. And they have tremendous effect on people without them realizing that, in fact, they are being affected by these ideas. And so I want all of these people exiled from Athens. And stuffy people like Plato are always, of course, afraid of emotion, because ideas can be manipulated. As we know, every day we turn on the TV or listen to any politician open their mouths, we know full well how ideas can be manipulated. But when people get angry, when people get upset, when people get emotional, then things change. And so storytelling as an art form is a very powerful form. It is, in my sense of things, the most powerful way to put ideas into the world. And so it cannot be done irresponsibly. Um, and whether a storyteller works from fact in a biographical way or documentary way, from memory or from imagination, the storyteller is, for better or worse, a life poet. And as such, as I said, it comes with a great responsibility. The storyteller's task then is not just to express what is, but to make it meaningful and emotional simultaneously, and to give us a meaningful emotional sense of what it is to be a human being, to be alive in this existence. And this is no small task, because life itself, of course, is the problem. Ever since the first pre-Homo sapien thought the thought, the first human thought, the thought, I am, and came to realize that they exist, and suddenly created the famous mind-body split, life then has become the great problem for all of us, because we can no longer live off of our genetic imperatives, but we somehow have to make sense out of this. Because the next thought, after the first human thought, I am, came the next obvious thought, and someday I will not be. And the realization that in time, death will take us all. The realization that we are now living in what will be our future corpse is both terrifying and, of course, dreadful. And living, simply living day to day, does not teach us how to live. Human beings are, in fact, not made to live. Human beings were simply made to survive. And in order to survive, the mind then does whatever it needs in order to keep itself alive. And the mind then is capable of rationalizing any evil into a good. And all we need to do, once again, is turn on the TV. And we see all the horrendous evil in the world, and come to realize, if we give it any thought at all, that each and every person in the world who is doing what we think is evil, they think is good. And they probably think it is not just a moral good, they probably believe that they are doing a spiritual good, that they are doing God's work. And once we come to realize that, then you realize that every one of us is capable of such. And that there is no fundamental difference between cutting someone off in traffic and cutting them off by the head. The structure is the same. There is the desire to do harm, there is the action of doing harm, and then there is the pleasure in the harm that we do as we give somebody the finger in our rearview mirror and smile, okay? Because we just gave him a little bit of suffering. That is evil. And we all do it in the tiniest of ways, but under whatever circumstances, we realize we're all capable of doing it in massive ways, because we are just human and we have to survive. And so merely living within our human nature does not answer Aristotle's great question, how should a human being lead their life? And in order to get an answer to that question, what is worth living for, what is foolish to pursue, and once we understand what is worth living for, how do we then lead our lives in that direction? Humanity has invented 4 wisdoms: philosophy, science, theology, and art. 4 grand ways to apprehend reality and try to give ourselves the answer to that great question, how should a human being lead their life? But today, philosophy, who reads Kant or Spinoza that doesn't have an exam to pass? Religion has become an evangelical joke, as we see the horrors that are done in the name of religion, and always have been done in the name of religion. And science, I know many of you, of course, are scientists, but there was a time back in the 19th century when the world thought that science would finally explain everything, that science would tell us, that would answer Aristotle's question, indeed. And for decades, people looked forward to the day when science would finally give us all the answers. But now we know, of course, as our last speaker was just pointing out, that with every invention, every new gizmo and gimmick that science creates, it simply layers the world with yet another level of toxicity. And oral toxicity is one of the worst. And so what is left? Where do people go to get the answer to that grand question? God help them, they go to the movies. Looking for models of life. Trying to understand. As I said, it is never innocent. People don't go there just for diversion. It's never just for entertainment. I mean, that's the excuse. What they really want is to experience a meaningful model of what it is to be a human being, to reinforce perhaps their already stead beliefs in that good will triumph over evil or whatever that they're losing faith in. And so they go to the storyteller to have that reinforced. But the point is that they go to the storyteller in order to get the answer to that great question, in order to experience a model of what it is to be a human being, so that they can then somehow shape their own existence out of that understanding. Because the chaos of our days, of course, simply does not give us what we need. A great critic, Kenneth Burke, said in the 1920s, I'm sure, he said, stories are equipment for living. Life does not equip us to live. Stories do. They give us understanding of how human beings' lives are thrown out of balance, how they struggle to restore the balance of life, and the consequences of their choices and actions. And indeed, story, whether fictional or factual, whether realistic or fantasied, gives life its form. Story mirrors life. Story, in fact, mirrors the mind. There's been a great enterprise, certainly by science of all kinds, the social sciences, but also neurology and others, trying to understand how the human mind works. And the one grand idea that understanding that they have achieved in the last decades is that first and foremost, the mind organizes life as a story. This is how we put things together and understand things. When we think back, when we remember our life and try to make sense out of our life, how do we remember it? As a series of facts, as a deductive, inductive argument? Of course not. We take it and we create a little story for ourselves, a little inciting incident in which things went out of balance for ourselves, the struggle we went through to restore the balance, how and why eventually the balance was restored or not. But we put the past together into a little story in order to understand ourselves and our own existence. Story is a model of expectation, of anticipation, of planning for the future. When you think toward the future, toward what you hope will happen or you dread might happen, how do you try to prepare yourself for life? You imagined a little story for yourself, a coherent story with a beginning, a middle, and end, a hypothetical story that somehow then prepares you for life. That is just what we do each and every day in order to organize our own life. But in order to live as fully and deeply as we can, we need great artists, we need great storytellers to take that natural human capacity to organize life into story and tell stories that are brilliantly profound, whether they are comic or tragicomic, that give us a deep insight into life. And society has depended upon the storyteller for 4,000 years, or much more than that, 4,000 years of written stories since the Gilgamesh, and who knows how many tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years before that of oral storytelling. But the problem is this: the storytelling has to be of quality. Every generation has to tell the same fundamental stories over and over in their own vernacular, in their own way, but the storytelling must be true, it must be honest, it must be beautiful, powerful somehow. Because when storytelling becomes false, when storytelling becomes weak in a culture, life becomes corrupt and decadent. And by corrupt, I do not mean that word in the political sense of we become criminal, I don't mean it in the religious sense that we become immoral. I don't even mean it in the original Latin sense that we become simply rotten. Or all three of those things are certainly possible. I mean that life becomes inauthentic. It becomes shallow, narrow, insensitive, intellectually and emotionally impoverished. A decadent life is a mono-life, a flattened, constricted, emptied out life due to ignorance, addictions, fanaticism, cruelty, greed, any of the dark forces that suck humanity out of human beings. And so we need honest, insightful storytellers to shine a bright light into the dim corners of human nature and society and express the truth. And it is not enough merely to express the truth in the sense of exposing what it is to be a human being, but the storyteller must tell the story so compellingly and so well that in fact they prove it to the audience, that the audience is persuaded indeed of that truth against all the other competitors for truth. And it's not enough just to write a book, tell a story in a novel, produce a play or a film or television show, and have people turn it off with a sense of not having wasted their time. I mean, that's an achievement right there. But rather that they turn it off nodding, thinking, yes, that's the truth. That's just how ridiculous human beings are. That's how magnificent human beings are. That's what it is to be a human being. And this is regardless of genre, of course, and regardless of the medium. It simply must be convincing. As Aristotle said, a convincing impossibility is to be preferred to an unconvincing possibility. And this is true even, of course, especially perhaps, when you're working from fact. Stories based upon fact, documentaries and instructional videos of all kinds, stories based upon fact, the actuality must be convincing. It simply because it is based upon fact does not make it true, and it does not make it convincing. There are, of course, three great methods, and we've seen just this afternoon those methods at work. There are three great methods of persuasion. One is rhetoric, the PowerPoint presentation of point, fact, statistic, demonstration, etc. Therefore, and that can be very persuasive, of course, as I was enormously persuasive. I don't think I'm going to do the paper folding thing, but I am certainly going to be much more aware of sound and respectful not just of music but of silence, because I'm guilty of playing music in the background while I'm working too, which now that you pointed out really sounds stupid, doesn't it? And so rhetoric is a powerful means of persuasion. But so is appeals to emotion, and we saw a good bit of that. There's two ways to appeal to emotion. One is coercion. This is an appeal, of course, to the negative emotions in people through various tactics of intimidation, threats and bigotry and envy and anger and fear, and that's, in a nutshell, the political commercial. This is what politicians do in order to gain your vote, is they find various means to intimidate us, of course. And that, too, can be very persuasive. The other is seduction, which is an appeal to the positive emotions in people through tactics of pleasure-giving in association with whatever product or idea they're trying to convince us of. And they can show us wonderful pictures or sounds, of course, of nature, the sea, the mountains, landscapes and animals and whatnot that are all pleasure for us. In fact, there's 10 various pleasure possibilities in persuasion. You can make associations with community, appeals to family and to belonging to a group and the parent-child relationship. The physical pleasures, of course, of laughter, just having fun, good food, good wine, good times. Social power, appealing to people through their desire to achieve wealth and prestige. Victory of all sorts. We just heard Pavarotti during I win, right? So we love sports for that reason. It gives us a chance to experience a sense of victory. There's the aesthetic pleasures of art and the great pleasure of knowledge and good health, and of course the spiritual and the most persuasive pleasure of all, sex. And all of those then can be used in various forms to try to persuade people by either intimidating them or giving them, seducing them with pleasure. The third way to convince people, to persuade people, is to tell them a story. Because story incorporates all of that. Story incorporates information but dramatizes the information. It doesn't give it in a logical way, it doesn't give it inductively or deductively in that sense, but it does give it a causal logic. At the same time, as I said, it wraps it, the storytelling, inside of the beautiful emotions of just aesthetic pleasure, the emotions of the vicarious emotions of the storytelling itself, positive or negative. The aesthetic experience of emotion is a deep pleasure. Ask any kid who goes to horror films, okay? They literally have the piss scared out of them, and they love it for that, okay? And so that takes a negative emotion and turns it into something very satisfying. Compare, for example, 3 nature documentaries, An Inconvenient Truth, which is rhetoric, Winged Migration, which is pure visual pleasure, if you know that film, just birds flying forever, versus, it was beautiful, versus another bunch of birds, March of the Penguins. And I would argue that more people were persuaded to do something for penguins after March of the Penguins than An Inconvenient Truth and or Winged Migration, because it told a story about little parent penguins and their little baby penguins and the terrible struggle to survive in the Antarctic. Story persuades because, unlike the other forms, story admits the negative. The only way to tell a story is to throw life out of balance, arouse in a character, the protagonist, the desire to restore the balance of life, and then they go into heady conflict with the forces from their own inner lives, their own mind, body, and emotions, forces from their personal lives, friends, family, lovers, society, institutions in society, individuals in those institutions, and the physical world itself. And the story then is told dynamically by moving the character to the negative and exposing, indeed, all the negative forces in life as this character may confront them. Then turns back to the positive as the character finds some means to struggle through those negative forces in pursuit of the balance of life, whatever object of desire we call it that the character feels will restore the balance of life. But then it goes back to the negative. As the forces of antagonism multiply and concentrate and focus, and on it goes. Positive, negative, positive, negative. And as a result, someone experiencing a story where the storyteller has moved them in that dynamic comes out persuaded because they realize that when people use rhetoric, they hide every fact that contradicts what they have to say. When people use statistics, they manipulate them. When people use all of the various devices, even the emotional devices, like sex and advertising and whatnot, they don't bother to show you venereal disease. They don't admit the negative. And as a result, somebody sitting there listening to that kind of effort to persuade is thinking every contradictory thought. And you may or may not persuade them. If you're good, you may. But if not, they have their own authorities, their own statistics, their own way of seeing things. But story takes people emotionally into another person's life and turns them back and forth between the positive and negative and persuades them of the truth, even if the audience doesn't like that truth. And indeed, the most important truths in life are inevitably bitter truths. And so I give my lectures around the world in order to help people tell stories more effectively, in order to express themselves as artists, or in many cases persuade, of course, the world, realizing that, that story may be equipment for living, as indeed it is, but that doesn't mean that all stories are good. And the great danger, of course, is that people will use the power of story for harm, and that there's ugly stories, there's lies, there's propaganda, and that very effective storytelling can tell a lie just as readily as it tells the truth. And you can wrap lies in emotions just as much as you can wrap truth in emotion, and that Plato wasn't altogether wrong. That storytellers are indeed dangerous people. And so all I ever do is, when I'm done with a lecture, I simply say, tell your stories, tell them from the heart, tell them as beautifully as you know how, and then once you've finished the story and you look down at it and you ask for its meaning. The story tells you its meaning. The story expresses how and why life changes. And when you understand the meaning of your work, the next question I would ask you to ask yourself is, and do I believe that? Is this an honest expression of what it is to be a human being? Do I believe in the meaning of my own creation? And if the answer is yes, then do everything possible to get that into the world. But if the answer is no, you don't actually believe the meaning of what you've done, then please do us all a favor. This is why God gave us the delete key. Thank you all.